Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is the Regenerati News Hour featuring Austin and Gregory, who are co-hosting today. Thanks everyone for joining and for coming over from your various parts of the world to gather and convene on an incredibly consequential and exciting time. Austin, why don't you bring us into a space, help us set a field on what's moving for you while we're bringing together the squad.
Totally. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Hear you just fine, Austin.
Okay, great. I feel compelled to do that every time. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited about what's going on. It's been a little bit since I've been on the news hour, so stoked to be back and thinking about lots of things that are moving and shaking in the cosmos space, which is exciting that maybe we'll get into a little bit today and maybe invite some devs for subsequent weeks. Also excited to think and get stoked about Cosmoverse, which is coming up pretty soon, and how Regen's going to be participating in it and showing up, the whole squad going down there and showing up, which I'm really looking forward to. And then in my neck of the woods in the foundation, really getting to like an exciting point where we have several community staking DAOs sort of up and running and informed and inspired to own and govern the network. And that group is called Cohort 1. It's the first cohort of the community staking DAO. So I'm stoked they exist. There's a lot of really interesting challenges and questions that are happening within the sort of endowment initiative, and that's my neck of the woods. So yeah, as time permits, I'm happy to go into that either now, later, on a subsequent one. But yeah, it's a very active time in the space here in the later part of the summer, and I'm super excited.
Yeah, and from my end, I'm sort of sensing that we may sort of like totally hijack the call and take a
Hijack it.
giant deep dive into the emergence of this what Redemption DAO is working on, which is ambitious and scary and important, to sort of try to interfere with the closed bidding of a block of oil concessions in the Democratic People's Republic of the Congo. Or just Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. I don't think there's a people's in there, and just people thinking through both the future, and I think Austin, this is going to be like it's a rich opportunity to talk about, for instance, why Regen Network has created the community staking endowment program and what the relationship is around community inclusion at that layer one level and like the nested governance up. I think there's themes around, just like there's a lot of rich themes around community inclusion. There's a lot of rich themes around governance. There's a bunch of stuff about land tenure. There's politics and drama and money, and it's got all the things. It's like a very rich living conversation. So just to put it out there that I was just hopping straight out of that world, trying to just like be a resource for that team that's trying to make a run at that, and into this. And so that's why it's fresh on my mind. So
No, I
um,
say hijack away, and yeah, take us there if you want. Let's go.
well, I'm also just kind of looking out to see if there's folks who are hopping in from that conversation, and people who are interested. Please raise your hands to sort of like start building the plurality of voices around this. We may meander a little bit on our way there, and that's going to be just fine. So, in the meantime, I'm not seeing a lot of the folks who were like, because I sort of hard stopped out of that conversation and went right into this. So, maybe in the meantime, I think sort of recontextualizing, I believe a lot of what we're doing at Regen Network is there's this term that I first heard in a Kim Stanley Robinson book called Nemawashi, which is Japanese for the art of preparing to transplant a mature tree. right? Which is this sort of like
Very
beautiful
nice.
image of all of the very hard work that it takes to do something transformative, to really like, and they use, I think in Japan it's used a lot in the context, or was used a lot in the context of transformational change in organizations, and it's like the conversations, the capacity building, the culture building. So you're not just sort of like, oh, we're snapping our fingers and we're making this big change. And that concept of nemawashi, or building kind of the capabilities and capacities needed to change and evolve a system, feels like a lot of what we do in the Regen Network community, where we're trying to grow the capacities and capabilities around science, open science, digital monitoring and reporting, verification, machine learning, remote sensing. There's this whole need to be growing our capability to do that together quickly in public in an open source way, to anchor our findings, to replicate those findings. There's this whole line of trajectory around governance. Who decides, how do we make decisions, and about what, about scientific methodologies, but also about value and about governing economic parameters, right? And then there's this whole sort of financial literacy. So there's just so much of these sort of like spinning flywheels, where we're slowly growing the capability of an entire large community, global community. Uh, you know, I'm always saying, the climate crisis is global, but regeneration is local, and that capacity and capability needs to be rooted in place with real people. And then all of a sudden, as we're cranking away, doing all this hard work, laying foundations, building capability, building communities, all of a sudden these emergent moments or opportunities start to emerge, right? Where all of a sudden um, there's an oil concession. One of the largest sets of oil concessions that's come up in recent history, in a very vulnerable place, in a place that probably um, deserves much better than to have another round of neo-colonial extractivism and oil pollution and degeneration and destruction, the heart of Africa and the Congo. And we all of a sudden, all of us are excited and we're moved and we want to ape in to that, to something good. And so today I'm just sitting with, how do we hold the tension between that sort of like present emergency and the long emergency, and the capacity and capability building that's demanded of us in rigor and building legitimacy, in doing things the slow and right way, versus the need, or to sort of like to respond swiftly and with clarity to a present moment emergency, right? That could be quite transformational. And so, so with that kind of framing, I definitely want to. I'd like to get your take on that, Austin. And again, I want to invite people who are listening, who are moved by this sort of emerging redemption DAO moment, to just raise your hand if you want to come in and chime. And Austin, while you're talking and everybody else, what I'm going to be doing in the background is trying to bring in some folks like Ricardo Bayon and other people who have experience with some of the previous attempts that the climate movement has made to do things like sovereign debt swaps, or the Yasuni Ecuadorian oil concession process, just to like bring people in who may have learned from previous mistakes, so that maybe that can be woven into the conversation. So with that, Asa, I'm going to pass the baton on to you to be, sort of like thinking out loud about all of this stuff. And I'm going to just try to like pull in some folks who may have learned from mistakes in the past that we could all learn from in the present.
Oh, totally. I like the framing of bringing in people who have learned from mistakes in the past. Yeah, I think that one of the really interesting things about the space that refi is in writ large, but definitely Regen Network specifically, is that it's coming from a kind of a space of velocity, a sort of hype and an expectation that works at the speed of tech, scales at the speed of tech, and there's a certain set of assumptions and expectations around how that's supposed to play out and what timeline that plays out on, and the living world, the biosphere, never agreed or consented to work at that timeline. And as part of the regenerative economic movement, the regenerative finance movement that Regen is a part of, it's in some ways bridging those two worlds, the world of ecological succession time and what that takes, and the sort of movement and velocity of starting a protocol, starting a ledger, and the whole network that sort of forms around it. And I think that we don't really talk about that often enough, that there's this schism in terms of the speed and the process with which regeneration happens and what we would assume a protocol or a company or an organization would move at. And yeah, and to that end, it's stressful. It's stressful to be trying to play the long game here and not cede to short-termism or hype, and understanding where the real priorities are for those who are practicing regeneration, who are rooted in the sort of biosphere and the entanglements that happen therein. So I'd like to think that we're going carefully and going slow and fixing things, going slow and cultivating things rather than moving fast and breaking them. And yeah, as I mentioned before, and Gregory mentioned, like the sort of foundation's initiative is to root the growth of this refi network in the voices and the people who are, and more than people, who are practicing land stewardship, who are regenerating the biosphere. And how does that perspective and how does that time enter into the Regen Network? How does it enter into the Twitter space or the like hype cycle that we see pretty commonly for different corporations or different like startups and things like that? And to actually make a network which is community owned and community governed presents this challenge, which we at the foundation are super familiar with, but the whole Regen Network is involved with it, which is this practice of bridging, of being in a place where there's so much to learn from land stewards and so much to learn from people who are working in interesting token economic and regenerative finance practices that we have to be like bridging and holding the two together concurrently, and allow that to be challenging, allow that to there to be a lot that's lost in translation, but we have to work to keep refining that language together and finding a common way to translate, and that's a super exciting kind of work. But it's hard, and I think like, and in as much as the climate crisis is a global challenge, but regeneration is local, each time we build a bridge towards understanding regenerative needs, we have to do that kind of anew. Yeah, so I'm excited about the notion of new projects emerging in the Democratic Republic of Congo, other projects in Africa. Over at the foundation, we just, like I said, we have our first cohort up, and we really focused on like 3 primary regions where land regeneration is happening, and they're kind of prototypical around what circumstances, what contingencies, and what needs different land stewards have. And we were trying to be kind of strategic and curatorial about that. So we had 3 different locations. Like I said, one of them is the larger like South Asian region, Indian subcontinent. The second is Northern South America, so the Colombia region. And third is the West Coast of the United States, but a little bit further north, so in like Salmon Nation. And we're trying to incubate like regional, bioregional cells, what will become bioregional DAOs, to take on these sort of rooted, situated questions. So we've had this really exciting and interesting opening of investigation in these 3 different bioregions around like, what do regenerators need? How do these things actually touch down on the ground? And it's really exciting, really, really exciting. Happen to go more into that, but I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm going to hop in. I see Bhatti is, I'm going to add you as a speaker. Welcome, Bhatti, jumping over from Redemption DAO Conversations. Thanks,
Bhatti.
Austin. That's all super useful. And again, open invite to people who want to jump in and kind of surf this emergence of the conversation. Bhatti, do you want to say hello to everybody? And you're coming in fresh from the Google Meet over there with Redemption DAO. Welcome over.
Thank you, Gregory. So whenever this emergency comes, my thinking is what do we do as an everyday activity that kind of avoids such emergency happening. So my thinking is like, how do we go about creating strong and steady incentives to countries around the world where they can be sure that preservation and conservation of the forest is not in their not just as a environmental benefit, but it's also a financial benefit. So I know this carbon avoidance thing is one aspect, biodiversity credits are other aspect, but what else can be done to push these incentives around the world? It's something I'm thinking. Your thoughts would be highly appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, in short, I think the way that I sort of think about this is there's two stages here. So the first stage is, I don't know, I guess the the goodwill and commodity stage. And so some of this is we just need to build momentum around goodwill using collectibles and charitable donations and engaging, because we all know that it's necessary, the shift is necessary. And the combination of that plus the combination of this emerging ESG understanding that carbon emissions are a financial liability for corporates and therefore should be accounted on balance sheets, and sort of this ad hoc, strange carbon market world that we live in. So that's the world we live in right now. And in that moment, the two tools we have again are there's sort of like the non-fungible sort of goodwill donations and NFTs, and then on the other side, commodities like carbon credits. Maybe at some point, biodiversity credits will mature into a commodity. But right now, it's carbon credits that there's a commodity. And how do we link that value systemically? In the Congolese example here I was just sharing, I think the primary driver or incentive from a financial perspective for the Congolese government and people, where there is really, there's economic disadvantage, and there's a pretty strong case to be made for them to be able to develop their resources as the rest of the world has developed their resources. So the rest of the world, we really need to value, we need to sort of have an economic value, as you're mentioning, that not developing it is actually of more value to everyone, right? Not pulling the oil out of the ground, or if it's going to be pulled out, doing so in an incredibly sort of like restrained way, is the best path forward. We need to put an economic value on that in order to sort of drive, really just in order to be respectful, in order to be fair more than anything else, but also in order to align incentives and other things. So ultimately, these two tools that we have, the non-fungible sort of philanthropic approach and the fungible commodification of offsets, where you're offsetting the damage that you're doing through emissions or whatever it may be, really fall short. They're not enough. Somehow we have to cross this chasm in which regeneration itself and positive outcomes, public goods, the preservation and regeneration of common pool resources is respected as the value that it really is for people, and to account for that and to integrate that into our financial system. And that's a leap beyond carbon crediting into the world of, the world of strategic climate quantitative easing, a la Dr. Delton Chin's global climate reward that was spoken about in Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, or the sort of creating currencies that are creating price floors for these different units of public goods, so that it isn't just a pure accounting for negative to positive, but there's actually the birth of this value onto the balance sheet of our financial system, right? And if we remember, financial systems in some way could be can be thought of as medium of exchange of information. The Austrian School of Economics really, has some good things and some bad things, but some of the brilliant things that Hayek and others were reminding us is that money and the economy, one way to think about it and conceptualize it is a flow of information. And so, again, the information we may be intuitively understand. We may be able to get a glimmer of why it is so essential, the pricelessness of the heart of Africa in the Congo, in that beautiful ancient rainforest, and the biodiversity and the cultural traditions that are there, and how that will be continually eroded if we're extracting oil. Also, if we're extracting oil, we will be continuing to put atmospheric carbon into the atmosphere, which will perpetuate rises in sea level and more and more extreme heat waves and crop impacting crops. All of these negative externalities come from the short-term incentive to develop that oil. But what we can't do is forget that people do have the short-term incentive, and people do have the need to feed their families, or maybe there's an awful lot of just like the perceived need to make their money make more money. But nonetheless, all of that being said, we do, as Bhatti is saying, need to address that sort of short-term incentive alignment and realign the short-term incentives with long-term ecological health. And I think using that mental model of the two tools that we primarily have, offsetting and kind of like philanthropic giving, and an associated sort of like social signals around that, non-fungible tokens and badges and getting your name on bricks or whatever it might be, getting your name on buildings, that drives that reputation of being a good person. Those two things need to be transcended, and pretty quickly, right? We need to be thinking about how are we going to really hack into the global financial system and get these regenerative assets on the balance sheet of the sovereign wealth managers, on the balance sheet of central banks, and create crypto alternatives in which we're doing that. Like, how would we get these assets onto the balance sheet of Maker for issuance of DAI, or could we get it into the balance sheet as a cash equivalent backing USDC, or could we get it in as backing for the new interchain Intercoin? All of these questions, I think, are really important from the financial perspective. So that's just riffing a little bit on your great question there, Bhatti.
Maybe if I can hop in, I appreciate the sort of the need to surpass the sort of do-gooder fungible version and the commodification non-fungible version of it. And I'm wondering if part of the problem is formulated are we trying to create value without creating commodification? That in as much as commodification is removing a service or a practice or something from its context, from its web that it's sort of enmeshed in. Is there a way that we can describe, the ecological processes as having value without commodifying them, without removing them from their context completely, but still saying they have value, but keeping it in situ? So your formulation brings that to mind.
Well, I don't think shying away from commodification is the answer. So it's sort of like that'll be my disclaimer.
Sure.
But I do think, yes, like that continuum between non-fungible and fungible, or unique and commodity, is really at the heart of this. And how do we govern that? How do we go through that process? And clearly, we haven't been doing it so well of late. But I do think, I do think it has to. There is some. Yeah, I think that's the right question. Like, how do we do that? But I don't think we do that by making it always completely unique, if you know what I mean. Like, there has to be a translation process between what is common, like, like carbon in a living system, a ton of carbon in a living system, um, is a pretty decent proxy potentially. Although, well, I mean, even if as I say that, I think of all the exceptions. But let's just say there's a case to be made for a ton of carbon that is in the atmosphere, kind of having a fungibly negative value, if that makes sense, right? Because there's a negative externality, for any ton of carbon above a certain ppm, which we could say it's 350 parts per million, and anything after that, we're causing a negative externality to our society, and mostly to our society. I think maybe you make a case for negative externalities to the rest of the planet, but I'm not so sure about that. Um, the planet will evolve. I think probably the planet is more upset with the other massive environmental degradation that's underway besides the carbon. But um, so there's a negatively fungible unit that I think there's a pretty good case to be made for that. On the other side of things, is you know avoiding emissions the same as drawing carbon down? No. Is a ton of carbon in the peatlands of Congo the same as a ton of carbon in the boreal forest of Siberia or Alaska? No, but they do have sort of the same unit relationship with the global climate situation, if that makes sense. What are your thoughts about that? Bati, you've got your hand up. You should jump in
Yeah.
there.
So what I'm thinking is like when you think about commoditification of these values, uh, carbon credit, for example, and then there comes methodologies that in a way restrict assigning the real value to what it means. The carbon sitting in the ground in terms of oil, and the carbon sitting in the atmosphere doing all the uh, heat capturing and consequential, climate change related other, issues that it will create. So I think the way carbon credit has been looked at so far needs to be changed based on what you described so far. And thinking out loud, just in my wild brain, how about a system wherein you purchase a gallon of oil and you see that the price does not just reflect for the gallon of oil, but the species destroyed while the oil was extracted, a health hazard that was created because the emission that will go when you use that oil in operating your automobile. So do you think of can you imagine an invoice saying that you have $100 for the gallon of oil, $100 for the health hazard that you are creating for the people around you, and $100 for other unknown uncertainties and consequences that will be here because you are using that oil? Do you think we can somehow, figure out a way to, put these negative externalities into the accounting framework of when we look at the carbon credits?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of that's kind of the ESG approach, right? Where you're starting to account for the carbon liability on balance sheets and standardized reporting around that, and then kind of sort of like forcing price discovery around um, avoiding that negative externality as sort of like the primary strategy. I mean, I think you're pointing to the heart of how the current kind of carbon accounting system works, right? Unless I'm missing something. And I think I think that we shouldn't abandon that. I think that's a sort of okay, but it has its limitations. I'm just thinking, but within those limitations, like if we're just thinking out loud again, I think which is the name of the game at this stage. In Congo, in like the sort of like the movement that Redemption DAO is trying to build specifically around that place in Congo. Um, you have the avoided emissions that are there if that oil never leaves the ground. You have the avoided emissions from the roads and the forest degradation. And I was reading a little bit about the massive peatlands that are in that part of the Congo Basin. As you start to cut roads through, they will start to dry out. The hydrological dynamics will change. That's another giant avoided emissions. In addition to potentially carbon sequestration outcomes that could be chosen instead in that ecosystem. So you have this massive bundle of potential public goods, right? Versus this bundle of private goods, meaning we can enclose the commons and we can extract oil and we can sell it to an energy hungry global economy and make a bunch of money. So the question is, at this moment, have we reached a societal balance point where we can tip the scales to chime in and say there is more value for that oil to stay in the ground and for that landscape to be transformed in a regenerative way that is respecting the local culture and empowering local citizens and ecosystems? Have we reached that point? Right? Have we reached the balance point? Can we make it happen? It's a big question.
Maybe one this makes me think of, to chime in, maybe one of the challenges in understanding if that the nature of that tipping point is that with, say, carbon sequestration that's not based off of like keeping things in the ground or projection based, that we would have a set of MRV, a sensory apparatus, however complex and interrelated it was, that was able to make clear attestations with quantifiable uncertainty and with a clear level of additionality around what regeneration has happened. And I'm wondering how keeping something in the ground so that it was, thus a public good, how that can stand next to MRV systems which have clearly quantifiable and measurable indicators of regeneration, because one of them seems like it could be quite speculative because we don't know if that would have burned down from a forest fire for some reason in 3 years from now. And so one of them is a kind of more projected form of value, whereas the other one is more directly measurable. And I'm curious what you think about how those two can play with each other and if they really are that different.
That's a great question. I think, if you're putting on your Homo economicus thinking cap, right,
Sure.
where everything is sort of like a tit for tat accounting problem to be solved, you might apply some sort of discounting equation around uncertainty. And this is one of the reasons, for those of you who might remember the very interesting conversation that we had with Matt Perkowski about active inference modeling, where there's a formal statistical method to quantify the uncertainty of anything, kind of, right? It's using Bayesian statistics. That's where you start to see potentially kind of the ability to calculate that real, and there's risks. Let's face it, there's also risks related to oil extraction. There's market risks of ups and downs of prices. There's risks of spillage. There's risks of explosions or whatever. So everywhere there's risk. How do we calculate and incorporate that uncertainty into how we're valuing things is a classic economic problem, right? I tend to think that we need, this is why I think I've been so adamant in the Regen sort of open science community around a focus on the quantification of uncertainty related to how we're monitoring ecological state as just sort of like the base level, instead of so much focusing on getting the highest degree of certainty the quickest, instead focusing on having a standard system where we're accepting uncertainty and creating sort of a standard reporting system around that uncertainty, because that allows you to have this kind of like value translation system, I think, which is pretty important. Ed hopped up here. I'm just about to invite Renee. Thanks for joining. And I see Matt in the room as well. I'm really hoping, Matt, if it's possible, will be able to hop up because he had some experience going through the cycle around Yasuni. And I know he's about to be in a meeting, and this may be not the most opportune time, but I was really hoping Matt could share a little bit about the Yasuni Ecuador context. So, Ed, do you want to say hi briefly while I'm bringing Renee up on stage and just share anything that you're thinking? And then, Renee, I'm excited to have you chime in.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I think we're seeing in the United States right now, at least, I saw a NASA map of root zone moisture across the U.S., and it was pretty not good. It's not just yields that are going to be affected, but actually crop failures. Actually went to a UMass soil health field day yesterday, and their corn looked awful. And I think, people are very moved by if there's not food available. And I think we're going to be seeing that a lot more. And when it relates to regenerative agriculture, I had an interesting experience a couple months ago. Jim McGovern, who's very strong in SNAP and food issues and food security issues in the U.S. House, put on a local event around our local food system. And he kept using the word climate smart agriculture, which is a term that was basically created by global food and mostly global ag. And afterwards, I went up to him and I said, how come you don't mention regenerative agriculture? And he said, I don't really know how to explain what it is. It's easy for me to talk to somebody and say climate smart agriculture. They get it. It's something that's climate smart. Now, I don't find climate smart agricultural practices very climate smart, but that's sort of the greenwashing of global ag. But I think trying to get that message out better, I think in the United States, it impacts so many other countries in the world because we have our extension agents and agronomists all over the world telling them what to do. And so for all these other poor countries, especially in Africa, I mean, you've got big Bill Gates with Agra, and that's not improving their situation. It's actually making it worse. So, and the reports have shown it. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities this year because as people find that there's not the food they expected, or that they go to their local farmer's market or something and the people that actually have good stuff still available are the regenerative farmers, and the commercial farmers are showing, well, I lost this crop or that crop. So I think food is a good thing. And once they understand regeneration through food, then I think they start bringing it into the environment and into finance and into a real systems change, paradigm shift in how they think about things. So
Right. So what you're saying there, Ed, is that the sort of embodied experience of in a food system of understanding discerning between two different approaches, one that's super extractive and one that's regenerative, might offer that pathway for people to start to sort of value the more intangible at a higher level. I love that invitation.
Exactly.
So I want to shift over. Renee, welcome on stage. It was great to be jamming with you before this space is spun up about Redemption DAO. Do you want to just say hi to everybody and share some thoughts? And I also want to make sure that Matt, if you have, sorry, Renee, if you have like 5 seconds and you to drop us Yasuni wisdom, just raise your hand.
I'm actually good for about 20 minutes, so I can wait for Renee to intervene and then say something if you'd like.
Fantastic. That would be great. Thanks, Matt. Renee, welcome.
Hey, thanks a lot for inviting me to speak. I mean, it's a very awkward situation where I want to say something what was mentioned like already 15 minutes ago. But I hear it a lot that people are concerned about wildfires. So what if the land we are protecting is burning down? So what was it good for? But wildfires are such a natural process. They are part of the history of every forest. Forests like they are today wouldn't exist without a wildfire who brings new nutrition to the ground, gives a chance for new flora to win the race to the sunlight. And if you look at the redwoods, the biggest tree on Earth, they only grow after wildfire. So I think that's very important to understand that the world was in perfect balance with wildfires, but the human activity kind of throws a lot of balance. So don't be afraid of wildfires and appreciate them as long as they're not human-made.
Cool. Thanks for that observation. Yeah. Great. Well, sort of transitioning here, Matt, Matt, great to have you up here. I was thinking, as I was startled by the similarities. I mean, I shouldn't be startled really, but noting with surprise some of the similarities between the context of what's unfolding right now in the Congo and what unfolded in the past, and kind of like in all the way into the present in Ecuador and many other countries around the world. Anywhere where there's this sort of extractive neo-colonial economy and this tension with where we need the economy to go, this sort of stuff is unfolding. I know you wrote a really brilliant piece about how Yasuni unfolded, some of the learnings there. I believe that you and some colleagues were involved in different ways of that, or maybe your wife was involved in different ways. So I'd love it if you would just sort of drop a little bit of wisdom for us around that kind of previous case study in which there was an attempt to try to keep the oil in the ground.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the invitation to talk about it. And I apologize for the noise. I'm actually walking on the streets of Quito right now to a meeting to talk about origination on the coast of Ecuador. But yeah, I was actually living abroad when I got called back to Ecuador to work on the Yasuni Itete project. For those of you who don't know it, it's a national park in Ecuador, in the Amazon, about 10,000 square kilometers. And the government had this proposal where they would leave the oil in the ground. There's about a billion barrels of oil there, in exchange for international compensation at the then rate for the price per barrel of oil. The government initially set up a trust fund that would be managed between the government and the United Nations as a way to signal trust to donor countries. Only one or two countries ended up signing up. And a big part of that was because the government at the time was not inspiring trust in the donors. The government eventually, when it canceled the project in 2017, blamed the donors for not putting their money where their mouth is. But ultimately, the single lesson that we can take from the Yasuni Itete is trust. And one of the things I had speculated about in something I'd written in Spanish was that if we had crypto then, and if we had DAOs, then we could set up a DAO to participate in the oil auction. And we're seeing that happening today in Congo. That's what everybody's kind of woken up talking about today, which is a really interesting opportunity for the world to, again, put their money where their mouth is and say, I actually value, there's groups of people that value keeping these minerals in the ground more than exploiting them. And we should be allowed to participate in an economic process similar to the companies that want to exploit these minerals. And so the way that the government portrayed the outcome of Yasuni today was, of course, we need these resources for oil or for education, for health. Unfortunately, the exploitation has been plagued by corruption, which is something we often see in developing countries when we're talking about oil, gas, and mineral extraction. And that's always a strong argument in a country where there's so many needs and where people are often struggling to make ends meet. And they also promised us that the environmental impact was going to be minimum. But of course, when you're dealing with such a complicated ecosystem, I mean, even the noise from their operations will move the monkeys from one place to another, which is a major source of protein for the uncontacted tribes that live in that area. So there's no way to go about extractive activities in these areas without doing massive damage, and damage that we can't really see or measure, because it's hard for us to know where the uncontacted tribes of the Amazon are. It's hard for us to know what hardships they're facing. Um, so I would boil down my intervention to say that the thing that we can do today that we couldn't do then is trust. And if we can continue to build systems that enable trustlessness, then we will have much more success in the future.
Right. So the invitation there, Matt, it sounds like is, and there's I will tweet about this out there, but back in 2019, I think the Regen crew created sort of just a mock-up in a hackathon, actually all working, related to creating an escrow endowment, right, and linking it to satellite proof of forest, and then having a payment system where, as long as that forest is there, it gets paid out to a set of stakeholders. And I think in that case, it was all direct to people who would be living on the ground. You probably need to cut in government in order for it to get the go ahead. But that kind of like integration of technology where we're saying, like, look, instead of relying, it's like a neo institution in a way, instead of relying on the institutional apparatuses, which are pretty shaky, rule of law is pretty shaky, we can kind of lean on these new Web3 institutions that we're building and some new technologies, and we can establish a much deeper level of trust that money is being directed directly to land stewards, that the forest is being preserved, and that if somehow that changes, the conditions change. So there's sort of a contingency based agreement there that wasn't possible back when all of this was playing out in Yasuni.
That's absolutely the case. And I would just add that we still have a lot of work to do to educate our regulators, because just the other day I was talking to an investor who had a meeting in the Ministry of the Environment here in Ecuador, and one of the officials in the Ministry of Environment said, well, how would we transport the carbon from the source of sequestration to the company that's purchasing it? And when he said that to me, I just realized that we cutting edge, but government is always a few steps behind. And rather than just demand that they be at the same stage as us, we have to go in and do the hard work of educating them.
Totally. Bati, what's on your mind?
So with respect to doing fundraising for specific events like this, how about this could be interesting for Regen Foundation. We have a global fund specifically aimed at forest preservation, and I personally, from very long time, since I knew about climate change, I had a dream of buying some piece of land and putting it as it is, and just never touching it and let the nature take its due course. So I'm sure there are many people out there in the world who want to do the same thing in the best of their capacity. So we can tap into that desire of global goodwill to protect and preserve the forests world around. Go out there and let them put whatever they can, and let this fund, in a way, promote regenerative activities on ground. So I think this could be a doable thing starting from right tomorrow with the kind of tools we have.
Yeah, no, I actually agree that we are at the stage. Maybe it unfolds in a couple of different stages. I've been quite restrained, I think, in the redemption DAO conversations, advocating, instead of directly fundraising, that a snapshot gets set up and people can signal their support first, because there are a number of contingencies to sort of build trust, in the system, in the land tenure and the other things. But we also need to sort of like build momentum now and sort of signal that people are willing to chip in. And then once people chip in, I think, having governance over dispersal methods, clear MRV accounting systems, I think you're right, Bati. If we're not there in the moment where we can do it seamlessly, we're very close. We're very close to being able to do this. And sometimes maybe you just need to take the plunge and make it happen. I'm inviting Volkan up to the stage here. And let's see.
Hello.
Go ahead. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your great contribution to the refi people, Gregory and Regen Network. You are the one of the best platform right now, as I examined, and I just want to say that one of my friends from refi protocol in Turkey, who is here, Doğa Öztürk, just sent me one of article from Nobel Prizes. Have you heard about Ostrom theory before?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eleanor Ostrom's amazing eight principles for managing common pool resources. Yeah.
Yeah. The Common Stack just shared an article on Medium about the Ostrom theory, and I just want to say that Ostrom theory is greatly support your platform and projects. And I just want to say about Ostrom theory. Ostrom theory stated that local communities are the best at managing their natural resources, as they are the ones that use them, and that all regulation on the use of resources should be done at the local level, as opposed to a higher central authority that doesn't have a direct interaction with the resources. And I think this is the great example of the success of the Regen Network for now and the future. And thank you for contribution. I'm a little bit excited. Sorry.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for that observation. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, Dr. Yufan. Would you like to hop up and say hello and share some thoughts?
Hi, hello guys. First time ever listening to the regenerative finance community. It's very exciting. It's just a question that I wanted to raise with remote sensing and satellite images. Are we putting too much trust into image processing and remote sensing in measuring, not only, in a binary sense if the forest is there or not, but measuring growth of these forests? Because I've been seeing from NCX or other forest-based carbon credits frameworks that the growth will also be measured, and then the emission offsetting or reduction amount will be calculated that way through remote sensing and AI and so on. And I'm not super comfortable because I've done research in laser scanners and in image processing and so on. Even counting the trees from up above is not a very easy task. Forget about the growth of these trees and so on. So yeah, wildfires and stuff we can definitely monitor, but all the other things that are more complex, it's kind of hard to imagine for me. Are we, as a community, the offsetting carbon credits community plus the regen community, are we putting too much trust into remote sensing right now? Should it be developed further? What are the views on that?
I mean, yes, it definitely needs to be developed further. I don't think in any of the methodologies that are coming to Regen Registry anytime soon that the mistake of putting too much trust into remote sensing is being made. I think I think it's in any verification and monitoring of ecosystem health and quantification of ecosystem state, I think needs to have multiple layers. So remote sensing is pretty great, and I think we can build quite precise and accurate monitoring systems over time. But you always have to have on the ground data to corroborate I'm not familiar with any forestry methodologies that are purely relying on remote sensing at this stage, other than maybe making a very general claim. And this is, you might not have been in the meeting at the beginning, but you know, foundationally, the really important piece here is to quantify uncertainty related to claims. So I'm personally pretty comfortable with a high degree of uncertainty when something is directionally correct. I have a set of first principles. Preserving forest is good. Perennial agroforestry systems are good. We don't have a high degree of precision around carbon outcomes, but they're directionally correct and important for biosphere health. I have a belief around that. So as long as we're reporting transparently on uncertainty related to claims, and we're discounting appropriately the units that are generated through those methods, I feel pretty comfortable with that. That's a very different approach than saying we're 100% certain. But and probably you would resonate with this. All Earth observation science, landscape ecology, quantification of nature is uncertain to some degree. And so we're always going to be getting more and more accuracy and precision as we improve data collection and models and analysis. So we'll sort of forever be in the state. So I think we need to get good at how do we handle uncertainty, not how do we sort of get to a stage where there is no uncertainty, because I don't think that'll happen if we're actually doing good science.
I mean, I heard you speak about discounting uncertainty and so on, and I think that another potential mechanism there for any sizable initiative is to insure these claims. If it's big enough, if there is enough funds in an effort, whether it's a DAO or anything else, if there's a wildfire in one of the forests that you're preserving, you can replace that with some other resource that you have in the pool. So there might be an insurance mechanism on that.
100%. And all I think all crediting systems currently running on Regen and more broadly in the system have individual buffer pools. Somewhere between 20 and 40% based on uncertainty and other things so that things can be reimbursed from that single thing. I think socializing the question, this raises a question of fungibility, right? What units are you willing to take in exchange if something happens, whether it's a methodological error or whether it's force majeure like a wildfire or something like that. But I think you're pointing right in the right direction around sort of socialization of the risk, creating insurance systems, answering the fungibility question between different vintages, and then being able to ensure that that purchase is basically safe because there is a pool that is capable of reimbursing. So I think that's 100% right on.
Thank you for the opportunity to raise the questions, guys. I'll be listening. I'm just getting off the speaker stage. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for a great question, Matthew. Thanks for hopping up. We're just rubbing up against the end of the hour here. Do you want to say hello and share anything briefly?
So thank you for the invite. I'm on Twitter, obviously as @Equimat, and if anybody's looking to connect and talk about origination here in Ecuador and Latin America, I'm always happy to discuss that. So glad to connect.
All right, and Matthew Bonstetter, sorry, I think we're going to have to end out this.
No worries. I didn't even request to speak. I was, so no worries. I was just listening. You guys are doing great.
Oh, awesome. Okay, cool. Well, super appreciative of everybody. Hopefully this was helpful for folks to get a little bit of a deep dive into first off, the amazing stuff that's happening with Redemption DAO, how some of the thinking and foundations that are being built here in Regen Network and the community might inform and empower that effort in the Congo, and just sort of exploring some of the tensions that are part of this ongoing conversation. So super grateful for everybody's time, and to everybody listening out there. Thanks everybody. And if you've got, I would just sort of make the call. I haven't actually reviewed the snapshot proposal that Redemption DAO put up, kind of at my bequest. I said, hey, I don't really feel comfortable jumping directly into fundraising. You guys, there's so many contingencies and dependencies that we really need to slow down, but let's start collecting digital signatures. I will tweet it out. I would invite everybody who's interested in that as sort of an emerging opportunity to signal that there is a support for keeping the oil in the ground and taking a regenerative route, to review that snapshot proposal. And if you feel comfortable with it, signal, like vote on snapshot, to start gathering momentum. And I haven't read it yet, so I can't say if it's a good proposal or not. But just the fact that that's the route, instead of just asking for people's money right off the bat, I think is a massive improvement and pretty exciting. So, I'll do a quick Twitter announcement of that snapshot. I will be reviewing it myself. I'll let everybody know if I'm choosing to vote yes as well. So I'm just on the landing the Redemption DAO plane into the conversation, that as an emergent moment. So Austin, thanks for helping co-host, and thanks everybody for a great conversation.